Why Japan's best codebreakers quit after hearing this voice. The room was silent except for the scratch of pencil on paper. Japan's finest cryptanalysts sat hunched over their equipment in the spring of 1942, headphones pressed tight against their ears. They had broken British codes, they had cracked Dutch naval signals, they had intercepted and decoded American military transmissions with frightening regularity. These men were among the best in the world at what they did. But what came through the radio that day stopped them cold. It wasn't Morse code. It wasn't any cipher they recognized. It wasn't even a language they had ever encountered in any training manual, any intelligence briefing, or any academic text in Japan's vast military archives. It was something else entirely, something ancient, something alive. And no matter how many hours they spent listening, analyzing, cross-referencing, and comparing, they could not break it, not even close. What they were hearing were the voices of young men from the American Southwest, men who had grown up in poverty on a reservation, men who had been told for generations that their language was worthless, men who had been punished as children for speaking it in government schools. Those men and their ancient tongue would go on to protect the most critical military operations of the Pacific War. They would save American lives by the thousands. And Japan's intelligence apparatus, one of the most sophisticated in the world at that time, would never figure out why. This is the story of the Navajo Code Talkers. It starts, as most great American stories do, with someone the establishment ignored. His name was Philip Johnston. He was a civil engineer living in Los Angeles in early 1942. He was not a soldier, he was not a cryptographer, he was not a general or an admiral or a man with stars on his shoulders. He was the son of a missionary who had spent his childhood on the Navajo reservation in the Four Corners region of the American Southwest. Because of that childhood, Johnston had done something almost no outsider had ever managed. He had learned to speak Navajo fluently. And in January 1942, just weeks after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Johnston walked into the office of Major James E. Jones at Camp Elliott in San Diego with an idea that most military men would have laughed out of the room. He wanted to use Navajo as a battlefield code. Jones didn't laugh. To his credit, he listened. Johnston explained the problem first. The United States military was burning through communication systems that the Japanese kept cracking. Radio messages were being intercepted and decoded with alarming speed. Battle plans were being compromised. Lives were being lost because the enemy could listen in. The Americans needed something unbreakable. Then Johnston explained the solution. Navajo was a language spoken by fewer than 30 people outside the Navajo Nation who weren't Navajo themselves. It had no written form. Its tonal structure, its syntax, its entire grammatical framework bore no resemblance to any European or Asian language. It could not be found in Japanese language schools. It could not be studied in any foreign intelligence program because there was almost nothing written about it to study. And for a battlefield code, that obscurity was a fortress. Major Jones was skeptical. Any reasonable military man would be, but he told Johnston to demonstrate. In February 1942, Johnston brought 4 Navajo men to Camp Elliott. The demonstration was simple. Military officers relayed a series of field messages. The Navajo men translated them into their language, transmitted them by radio, and the receiving Navajo translated them back into English, all within 20 seconds. Marine officers who had trained on conventional communication systems stared at their stopwatches in silence. The fastest conventional code machine of the time took 30 minutes to encrypt and decrypt a single message. 20 seconds versus 30 minutes. The demonstration was approved almost immediately. The Marines moved forward with a pilot program. 29 Navajo men were recruited, what history would come to call the original 29. They were brought to Camp Pendleton in California and handed a task that had never been done before in the history of American warfare. They had to build a code from scratch, from their own language, in their own minds. There was no manual for this. There was no precedent. These young men, most of them in their late teens and early 20s, sat together and created a military communications system that would become one of the most closely guarded secrets of the entire war. The code they built was elegant in its design. Military terms that had no Navajo equivalent were replaced with Navajo words for things that matched the concept. A submarine became beshlo, which translates roughly as iron fish. A tank became chedegahi, a tortoise. A fighter plane was dahi-tihi, a hummingbird. A bomber was jay-sho, a buzzard. A destroyer was kalo, a shark. Grenades were potatoes. For spelling out proper names, they created an alphabet system. Each letter of the English alphabet was assigned a Navajo word that began with that letter's sound. The letter A was wolachi, ant. B was shush, bear. C was moasi, cat. But to prevent pattern recognition, many letters had multiple Navajo equivalents that could be used interchangeably, making statistical code breaking nearly impossible. The whole system existed only in the minds of the men who built it. It was never written down. It was never put in a physical code book that could be captured. It lived in memory, and that was precisely what made it unassailable. When the pilot program succeeded, the Marines expanded recruitment. By the end of the war, somewhere between 400 and 420 Navajo men would serve as code talkers across the Pacific Theater. They were assigned to every Marine division, every Marine Raider battalion, every Marine parachute unit. But before they could prove themselves in battle, they had to survive a war that many Americans didn't even know they were fighting on a second front. Because the United States had not exactly treated the Navajo Nation well. The Long Walk of 1864 was still alive in the memory of Navajo elders when these young men were recruited. The forced marches, the internment at Bosque Redondo, the starvation, the broken treaties, and then the American government school system, which had systematically tried to erase Navajo culture for decades. Children taken from families, children punished, sometimes beaten, for speaking Navajo on government schools. Children told their language had no value. And now, the United States Marine Corps was asking these same people to use that very language to save American lives. Most of the recruits signed up without hesitation. That fact should stop you for a moment. It stopped many of the Marine officers who worked alongside them. One officer wrote in a private letter that he had never met men with more quiet dignity in his life. They did not talk about patriotism in grand speeches. They simply showed up, trained hard, and did the work. When they arrived in the Pacific, the reaction from fellow Marines was often skeptical at best and hostile at worst. Native American soldiers faced racism within the ranks. Some were initially dismissed. Some were told to their faces that this whole code idea was foolish. One code talker recalled being asked by a white Marine what he was even doing there. The Pacific War answered that question. The fight for Guadalcanal in the southern Solomon Islands, beginning in August 1942, was the first major American offensive operation of the Pacific War. It was also one of the most brutal. Japanese forces were entrenched in dense jungle terrain, and American communication had to be fast, precise, and above all, secure. The code talkers were put to work. Messages flew through the radio in Navajo. Troop positions, artillery coordinates, supply requests, enemy sightings, in real time, in seconds, without a single decryption delay. Marine communications officers who had spent the battle anxious about compromised signals were stunned at how smoothly the system worked. Enemy radio operators picked up the transmissions and then did nothing with them because there was nothing they could do. The Japanese intelligence teams assigned to crack American communications heard the Navajo transmissions and reportedly described them as sounding like nothing human. That phrase, nothing human, was not an insult. It was a measure of how completely the code defeated them. By the time American forces clawed their way through Guadalcanal in February 1943, the Code Talkers had proven their value beyond any military doubt. Recruitment expanded, training intensified, and the code grew. The Central Pacific campaign that followed was where the Code Talkers became legend. Island by island, the Marines pushed toward Japan. Tarawa, Saipan, Tinian, Guam. Each operation was a bloodbath of concentrated fighting on small stretches of volcanic rock and coral. Japanese defenders had spent months building fortifications and were ordered to fight to the last man. American casualties at Tarawa in November 1943 shocked the home front. Nearly 1,000 Marines killed in 76 hours. Through all of it, the Code Talkers transmitted. They sat in foxholes with radio equipment while bullets passed overhead. They relayed information across beaches soaked with blood. They maintained communication when conventional systems broke down, when chaos turned structured battles into individual struggles for survival. And not one Japanese cryptoanalyst ever came close to breaking a single message. By 1944, Japan's military intelligence had become convinced that the Americans were using some kind of machine. They believed no human system could operate so quickly and so securely. They analyzed the transmissions obsessively. They brought in their best people. They tried every known code-breaking technique in existence at the time. Nothing worked. One Japanese signals officer captured late in the war was reportedly asked by American interrogators what he thought of the Navajo transmissions. He said his team had concluded that it was not a language at all. They thought it might be a corrupted form of Chinese or possibly a mechanical cipher disguised as human speech. They never suspected the truth. Then came Iwo Jima. February 1945. A sulfur-stained volcanic island 8 square miles in total, bristling with 21,000 Japanese soldiers who had spent months turning it into an underground fortress. Pillboxes, tunnels, artillery positioned to annihilate landing forces the moment they touched the beach. The airfields on that island were critical to American bombing operations against the Japanese mainland. The Marines had to take it, at any cost. The Battle of Iwo Jima became one of the most ferocious engagements in American military history. In 36 days of fighting, nearly 7,000 Americans were killed and almost 20,000 were wounded. Japanese casualties were even more catastrophic. Of the 21,000 Japanese defenders, fewer than 2,000 survived. During those 36 days, the Code Talkers were the central nervous system of Marine operations. Every artillery mission was coordinated through their transmissions. Every request for naval gunfire, every report of enemy movement, every urgent call for medical evacuation. 6 Code Talkers worked around the clock in shifts, transmitting and receiving in Navajo, without pause, without error. Major Howard Connor, the 5th Marine Division signal officer at Iwo Jima, made a statement after the battle that has echoed through history ever since. He said, and this is as close to his exact words as the historical record allows, that the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima without the Navajo Code Talkers. When the American flag was raised on Mount Suribachi on February 23, 1945, that image captured by Joe Rosenthal, becoming perhaps the most famous photograph of the Second World War, Navajo voices had helped make that moment possible. They transmitted the news of the flag raising. The message that went out from Suribachi that day traveled through a Code Talker's radio in the ancient language of a people who had been told for generations that their culture was something to be ashamed of. Think about what that means.
Outside the direct theater of the Pacific, the broader Allied code-breaking effort was also reshaping the war. At Bletchley Park in England, British and Polish mathematicians, under the brilliant and tormented Alan Turing, had cracked the German Enigma machine, giving the Allies access to Nazi communications throughout the European theater. The intelligence derived from that program, codenamed Ultra, affected virtually every major Allied decision in Europe and North Africa. The Japanese had their own encryption systems, machine-generated ciphers that American signals intelligence teams at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor had worked to compromise. Breaking Japanese naval codes had made the American victory at Midway in June 1942 possible, allowing Admiral Chister Nimitz to position his carriers perfectly against a Japanese force that believed it had the element of surprise. Code breaking had already changed the war, but the code talkers represented something different from all of that. Those were mathematical victories, brilliant minds cracking mechanical systems through patterns and computation, heroic, essential, world-changing work. The Navajo Code was a human victory, a cultural victory. It succeeded not because of technology, but because of heritage, because a group of men carried inside them something that no machine could replicate and no enemy analyst could decode. It succeeded because history accidentally preserved it, because the American government's attempt to erase Navajo culture had failed, because the language survived, because the people survived. And in surviving, they gave their country something no laboratory could have invented. The secrecy surrounding the code talkers did not lift when the war ended. The program remained classified for more than 2 decades. The men who served returned home largely unable to speak about what they had done. They could not tell their families. They could not explain the nature of their service. They attended community events in silence, while other veterans were celebrated, while the nation processed its victory, while the greatest generation was commemorated and honored. The Navajo Code Talkers stood to the side, bound by their oath. Some struggled deeply with that silence. One code talker, in an interview decades later, described coming home to a reservation still stricken by poverty and being treated as if nothing he had done mattered, because no one knew what he had done. He couldn't tell them. It was not until 1968, 25 years after the war ended, that the program was officially declassified, and even then, full public recognition came slowly. The Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor the United States government can bestow, was finally awarded to the original 29 code talkers in 2001, 56 years after the guns fell silent. President George W. Bush presented the medals at a ceremony in Washington. Several of the original 29 had already died. Their families received the medals in their place. 400 Navajo veterans who served as code talkers were awarded the Congressional Silver Medal in subsequent ceremonies. The story of the code talkers is told now in museums and classrooms and documentaries. There is a film, there are monuments, there are exhibits on the Navajo Nation itself, where the language that saved so many lives is today spoken by a dwindling number of elders as younger generations shift toward English.
That is the quiet irony that sits at the center of this story. The language that Japan could never crack, the language that no codebreaker in the world could touch, the language that moved across Pacific beaches at 20 seconds a message and helped turn the tide of a world war, is endangered today. There are fewer native Navajo speakers alive now than at any point in the language's history. Linguists and Navajo educators are working urgently to reverse that. Immersion schools have been established. Recording projects are underway. Young Navajo people are beginning to reconnect with the language their great-grandparents were punished for speaking. The war proved something that should never have needed proving, that the Navajo language was not a burden. It was not a source of shame. It was not a relic of a dying culture that needed to be swept aside by the march of progress. It was a weapon, one of the most effective weapons the United States possessed in the entire Pacific War. And it was carried not by generals, not by admirals, not by men who had attended prestigious military academies or been given ranks with stars. It was carried by young men from the most economically marginalized community in America, who had been stripped of their land, tried for generations to have their identity erased, and were asked at the moment of national crisis to save the country that had failed them. They did it anyway. That choice, that willingness, has never been fully explained to everyone's satisfaction. Some historians frame it as Native American patriotism and a deep connection to the land of their ancestors, regardless of political borders. Some former code talkers in interviews spoke about wanting to prove something, wanting to show the world what their people were capable of. Some spoke about duty in terms that had nothing to do with the United States government and everything to do with protecting their families, their communities, their way of life. Samuel Tso, one of the code talkers interviewed late in his life, was asked directly why he fought for a country that had treated his people so poorly. He paused for a long time before answering. Then he said that this land belonged to his people long before the United States existed. He was not fighting for the government, he was fighting for the land itself. That answer has stayed with historians ever since. When Japan's intelligence services finally understood what they had been up against, after the war, after the surrender, after the classified files began to be reviewed, the reaction from surviving Japanese intelligence officers was reportedly one of stunned disbelief, not because they had been outsmarted by a machine or a mathematical breakthrough they should have anticipated, but because they had been defeated by something they had never considered: a culture, a people, a language, something that had been dismissed as inconsequential even by many Americans for over a century. General Merrill Twining, a Marine officer who worked closely with the code talkers during the Pacific Campaign, said that the program was perhaps the single most original and successful communications security system ever employed in American military history. That is not a small statement. This was a war that produced radar, the proximity fuse, mass-produced synthetic rubber, the Norden bombsight, the bazooka, and the atomic bomb. American industrial and scientific ingenuity in the Second World War was genuinely extraordinary, a generational outpouring of human invention under pressure. And the single most original communication security system among all of it was a language that predated the United States by centuries. It survived boarding schools and government suppression and economic poverty and the long, slow erasure of forced assimilation. And then it went to war. History remembers this story now, but it almost didn't. The classification that was meant to preserve the code's utility in future conflicts also erased these men from the national memory for 2 decades. They came home to obscurity. They grew old in silence. Some of them died before the nation ever acknowledged what they had done. The ones who lived to receive their medals in 2001 sat in the Capitol Rotunda as old men, some in wheelchairs, some in traditional Navajo dress, some in their old Marine uniforms that no longer quite fit. They had waited more than half a century for that moment. When the medals were placed in their hands, several of them wept. It is worth asking, as this story closes, what we owe to people like that. To men who serve their country not from a place of received benefit, but from a place of something deeper and harder to name. To communities that give of themselves to a nation that has given them so little. The Navajo Code Talkers did not receive justice in any simple or complete sense. A medal, even a gold one, does not undo decades of silence or a century of dispossession. It does not restore what was taken. It does not reverse the endangerment of the very language that made the whole thing possible. But it is a piece of the record, and the record matters. Because every student who learns about the Code Talkers learns something that goes beyond military history.
They learn that the thing a society tries to suppress may turn out to be the thing that saves it. They learn that dignity does not require recognition to be real. They learn that the people history marginalizes are often the ones carrying something history desperately needs. And maybe they learn to wonder what is being dismissed right now that will someday prove essential. The Japanese codebreakers never cracked a single Navajo transmission. In the entire Pacific War, across thousands of intercepted messages, across years of analysis by some of the most gifted signals intelligence minds in Asia, they never broke it. The greatest code in American military history was not built in a laboratory. It was not invented by scientists. It was not engineered by a defense contractor with a government contract. It grew in the canyons and mesas of the American Southwest. It was spoken around fires. It was carried in the memories of children who were punished for using it. And then when America needed something unbreakable, it was there, waiting, surviving, ready. What else, hidden in plain sight, might history be waiting on us to finally understand?